It's so easy to become an inward-looking society when capitalism is all that matters. It's easy to insulate yourself with wealth. I mean, if you have wealth, well, then why should you care what's going on around you? I mean, you can isolate yourself and protect yourself from the things that you don't like. Well, but that doesn't promote a society where everyone is trying to get along. Humans are ultimately social creatures.
Welcome to Liberated Lyfe podcast. I'm Lindsay, and I'm here today with my friend Max Kautsch. I met Max through our mutual friend Cody Westerland. He is an attorney who practices in Kansas and Nebraska. For those of you who are my friends who went to KU Law, his father is indeed Professor Kautsch, who was my torts professor. He's now retired, but Max owns and operates his own law practice in Lawrence, Kansas, where he focuses on First Amendment rights and open government law. Welcome, Max.
Hi, Lindsay. Happy to be here.
Just to start out, I would love for you to share kind of just what you're passionate about, anything else that I didn't touch on in the introduction about you that you think is relevant.
So really the whole impetus for my practice and for journalism in general, not that I'm a journalist all the time, but occasionally, but for public interest law firms, political activists, journalists, the idea is to speak truth to power. And the only way to do that in as safe a way as possible, trying to avoid liability, is to actually get the government records. Because once you get the records, then something called qualified immunity attaches, as long as you fairly and accurately report on the records. So the government can really go a long way towards suppressing speech if the government unreasonably restricts access to records or meetings. So the whole nature of being able to do journalism in as safe a way as possible entirely depends on access to public records and public meetings. So when the government goes out of its way to restrict that access, it not only does it prevent information from getting out, but it also prevents those who would report that information from doing so in as safe a manner as possible. So as a result, it's incredibly crucial that the open records and open meetings laws are enforced fairly and reasonably so that the people in the state have an opportunity to challenge or verify the things that our elected and appointed officials tell us.
And it seems to be one of your missions here on Earth is to encourage that transparency, which was originally kind of why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because I personally, and I think a lot of people would agree, that liberation and freedom are intimately connected to transparency. You can't have freedom of choice if you don't know all of the facts. And so when we originally connected and we went to lunch so that I could pick Max's brain, I realized, man, this guy is one of the most intelligent and passionate people I've ever met in my life, number one. And number two, he informed me of some things that were going on in the local government here in Kansas, which are, maybe going on in all kinds of local governments, but particularly relevant for me because I live in the city of DeSoto. I grew up here, and we recently have had the Panasonic plant being built here in DeSoto. DeSoto is a very small town, so this was a huge deal. One of the biggest, if not the biggest businesses in Kansas, I believe. DeSoto was chosen to kind of host this business, and Max made me aware of the process by which that happened, which is super interesting. So Max, I'm curious, first of all, number one, I guess, how you uncovered this, and then, lead us down that rabbit hole, that journey of how you uncovered this and what you uncovered.
Sure. Well, the main thing is, as I maybe implied, but probably should have said more clearly, is that the legislature has passed this Kansas Open Meetings Act and the Kansas Open Records Act. So these are laws that purportedly have a great deal of applicability to virtually any sort of government entity. But the problem comes when, first of all, those are legislative fiat, which is to say that they are statutes that are just created by folks that got together who are empowered to make laws, and they made those laws. It's not like there's any sort of natural right or anything else that would cause those laws to be made. They are strictly the product of the legislature.
With the intention being transparency.
Right. Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, totally. The original legislative intent of both of those laws, and you can see them written expressly in the statute, which, doesn't happen every single time you see a statute passed. There isn't a statement of purpose in the statute, but there is in both of those. The one for the Kansas Open Meetings Act says that the legislature passed these laws or passed the Open Meetings Act so we could have a, quote, informed electorate. That's what it says. And then the Open Records Law says that it has to be liberally construed in order to promote the legislative purpose of transparency. So we start off with the notion that those laws, at the very minimum, have some decent lip service. And just in a general sense, while it's certainly true that neither of those laws are perfect, there are worse examples of both throughout in states throughout the country. There are better examples too, but it's really not so much the words on the page. If the words on the page were followed, that would generally be okay. But the problem, and what happened when it comes to the battery plant in DeSoto, and also with the more recent stuff that's happening with trying to lure the Chiefs and the Royals over, is that the legislature just can basically, whenever they choose, they can write a bill that exempts them, the legislature, from both from the Open Records Act and the Open Meetings Act, and they can do it whenever they want. And why is that? Because, again, it's legislative fiat. There's no constitutional backstop or anything that would prevent them from doing that. What they did was they got bipartisan support to pass a bill. The bill was called Apex. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but the idea was, we're going to create economic incentives to get a really big company to come to Kansas. So that was their objective. This sort of thing where you're incentivizing businesses to come, that happens all the time. The problem with luring Panasonic was that the bill that was created to do the luring had a provision in there specifically that said that all public discussions about the issue didn't have to take place in public, regardless of the Open Meetings Act. It literally says in the bill, it says regardless of it became a law. It's not just a bill, it's a law that said that we don't have to publicly discuss regardless of what the Kansas Open Meetings Act says. So what that does is it now has established a precedent, and this isn't exactly the first time that this has happened, but I will say anecdotally that this is a pretty dramatic instance of it. And so what we have then is the ability of the legislature to opt out of the Open Meetings Act and the Open Records Act whenever they want in order to further a clandestine business interest. And what's to stop them from doing that? There's only one thing to stop them from doing that, and that is to vote out the people who condone that, and to get new folks in office, or, of course, otherwise, to talk to your legislator and try to get them to do differently in the future, And so I think what's really troubling about this is that there's, again, this is a bipartisan thing. There's no way, if you look at what Apex, again, that bill that was passed that circumvented the core and the coma, I believe the final vote on that was something like 80-40, something like that. There was only 50% of the opponents, there was 100% and then only 50%. So 2/3, of the whole legislature, or the House of Representatives anyway. And then I think it was 27-9 in the Senate. So again, this was not just on party lines. These were Democrats and Republicans who, for whatever reason, believed that they had enough to gain to shortchange the public out of the opportunity to observe what's happening. And as far as how I knew about this, that article was published in the Kansas Reflector, and those guys over there have been, as far as I know, the only ones who have really pointed out how the legislature uses the opt-out provision and then basically use the State Finance Council as the vehicle to say, hey, this is the open meeting that we're not going to apply coma to. And then you funnel all of the decision-making to the State Finance Council, and then conveniently, oh, look, well, they're not subject to coma, so I guess they're just going to make decisions in the dark. So now with the Chiefs and the Royals thing, it's a little more complicated because they're skipping the State Finance Council. Is that possibly, I wouldn't say it's because of my article because it all happened so fast, but is it possible that the Reflector's pressure over the years caused them to think, hey, you know what, maybe we need a new vehicle? I mean, I have no idea. But now they have a new vehicle, which is the Legislative Coordinating Council. And so, but now it's just the same thing. So now rather than the State Finance Council making that decision in the dark, now it's going to be the Legislative Coordinating Council making the decision in the dark about how to allocate our taxpayer dollars to incentivize the Chiefs and or the Royals to come to Kansas.
Just for a second, I want to kind of just issue the statement that neither one of us is issuing an opinion about whether or not the Panasonic plant or the Chiefs and the Royals or whatever is good for Kansas or bad for Kansas. That is neither here nor there. You know, I love the Chiefs. I want them to come to Kansas. I love DeSoto. I want them to have a good business that's booming, right? But that does not change the fact that the law was not followed or it was circumvented to some extent in this situation. And so can you kind of explain what should have happened?
Sure. What should have happened is so if you go onto the Reflector's website, you can see a historical account of all the articles they've published about the State Finance Council. And they published one really early on in the inception in the history of that publication, which launched in the summer of 2020. And so one of their first articles that they published had to do with this issue. And so they've been pushing this, and that article goes to show what should be done instead, because that article talks anecdotally about how the State Finance Council never used to make its decisions in the dark, how the State Finance Council always before operated under the Kansas Open Meetings Act. And so for whatever reason now, I mean, I know some things that aren't out, but so I can't really speculate on why that all is. But what I can say is that, you know, I think it's fair to say that there was some sort of effort made by leaders in our state to change that status quo, you know, to make it so that rather than being able to observe the State Finance Council as had been standard operating procedure for years, you know, for some reason it changed. Why it changed, I'm not going to get into the fact that it did change. And so now there's a precedent that's been established since at least 2020, you know, that this is just business as usual. And that's what's really harmful because number one, if there's an ethos that it's business as usual, it becomes harder to question it. And then number two, when you have that ethos that's apparently carried out by a supermajority of the legislature on bipartisan lines, I mean, that really starts to make you wonder the extent to which a Democratic administration is committed to transparency. You know, and because transparency is not a partisan issue. You know, it's one of those things where if something is bad for one party when they're in power, or if it's good for a party when they're in power, what's going to happen when they're not in power, right? And so that's sort of the idea. You know, you always want to try to keep things even-handed because, you know, you never know who's going to be in power in a democracy where we have a peaceful transition of power, knock on wood. At that point, it becomes, how do we document this enough to get enough people to be worried about this? And so, you know, when my relationship with that publication, and I was stepping down as the Kansas Coalition for Open Government director, and so I had written a couple of columns in connection with that. And so then I was calling them and saying I wasn't going to be able to write in that capacity anymore. And then that's basically when our topic just a suggestion from an editor basically is, look, State Finance Council is a problem. Why don't you apply some of your legal training to see how much of a problem it is? And so that was the impetus for that article.
And so up until this situation, the State Finance Council had open meetings in which the public could at least observe, if not comment on.
Yeah, prior to 2020 at least. And I think that if we really went back, we would see that the shift happened sometime in the middle of the last decade. I think that it would be fair to say that prior to 2010, State Finance Council meetings were traditionally, I wouldn't want to say always because I don't know, but generally speaking, we're always open. And so that shift has been matriculating over the last 10 to 15 years. And the result, of course, is really devastating because these are extremely important. I mean, the final tax incentive bill that was given to Panasonic was $800 by the state's own account the day it was agreed to in July of 2022. And they said that in that documentation, again, this is a government record, right? So I'm not making this up. I didn't interview with somebody. I looked at a government record, and now I'm fairly inaccurate telling you what that said. And it said $829 million. That's what it said. It said $829 million. You know, the way that incentives work is that's $829 million that Panasonic won't have to pay, right? So that's $829 million that were Panasonic existing in DeSoto without the incentives, that would be $829 million that would go to the state. Now, of course, what would the proponents of economic development incentives say? I mean, they would say, well, there's no way Panasonic would come here without the incentives. So, I mean, and that's probably true. I mean, because they could pick anywhere, but still, the fact is that, and so the policy question, yeah, sure, is it right or wrong? Who knows? But the policy question is, to what extent is it more advantageous to the state to bring this kind of economic development, at the expense of trampling over transparency and establishing a precedent that is now, being carried out when it comes to the Chiefs and the Royals?
And correct me if I'm wrong here, that $829 million is coming from somewhere, right? If it's not coming from Panasonic, it's coming from the taxpayers.
Well, I mean, ultimately, it just means that $829 million didn't come from Panasonic, which means that if the state wants to pay for stuff, that's not money that they get to pull from, and they have to pull from somebody else.
Okay. And like I said, it's one thing for a big business to come to Kansas. Maybe we all would support that. Maybe we would all support it anyway. That's the thing, is like, okay, why have a secret meeting if there's not some fuckery afoot?
Well, and of course, that's the thing. If it was all above board, why did it have to be secret?
Right.
And
all agreed to it anyway.
Right. So that's the problem, right? Is because we have elected officials, and I think it's probably fair to say that Kansas is not unique in this. I think that's very fair to say, in fact. And so the idea is that we are going to work together as a government to make it so the public doesn't know the things that it's supposed to know, that the government can't figure, or that the people can't figure out what the government is trying to do. And if it was a legitimate enterprise that was based on rationale and based on good faith and good intentions, I mean, why would you want to take that step while with keeping the funders, the taxpayers who provided the money to even have this discussion in the first place, to keep them in the dark? And so so at this point, then you have Democrats and Republicans who agree that their constituents, that the interests of their constituents to know this kind of information, they know better, right? There's a paternalism involved here. Oh, the constituents, they're just constituents. They don't really need to know. Instead, what we need to do is to do $829 million in tax incentives behind closed doors, because we know better, and everyone will be fine with it anyway. That is a dangerous way to govern.
Do you think it could have something to do with like timing? Like they didn't want to take the time to. I mean, they had the meeting.
Well, the stated reason that they're going to give for the Chiefs and the Royals too, the stated reason is that if we come out with what our negotiation terms are, then our competitors who are also negotiating are going to undercut us. So I think the Panasonic thing came down to Oklahoma and Kansas, I believe. And so Oklahoma had to be, because of their laws, they had to be transparent about what they offered Panasonic. And then Kansas undercut them. And then Oklahoma was screwed because they couldn't get their act together in time to counter what Kansas did. So, again, Oklahoma, in that instance, valued their existing laws and their existing structure to have a good faith dialogue with the taxpayers. And as a result, they lost, quote unquote, And so in this country, when you have when capitalism is the main driver, you have a zero sum game where you have winners and losers. And, and if you are a politician and you run on a platform that's all about winning, it's really easy to sell to your constituents, hey, well, you didn't really need to know about this anyway, because we're going to win. See, look, the ends justify the means. And then what happens when you get a whole bunch of politicians who believe all that because their constituents all believe that, because anyway, I'll stop with that at that point. But anyway, the point is that we get the government that we deserve in a democracy. So, if any of us, if the majority of people think that what happened in the Panasonic thing is a problem, well, I linked in my article to every single person who voted for Apex. Go vote all of them out of office, right? That's a solution. And of course, so again, when we talk about a democracy and a representative democracy and the way this country was founded, even in their wildest dreams, do we think that the founders thought that this country was going to have 400 million people in less than 250 years? My guess would be probably not. And even if they did think so, I sort of think that they also would have thought, we might need to rethink how we, devised our Constitution, what our expectations were, and all this kind of stuff. But that didn't happen. And instead, we have a history of laws and precedent that has been heavily influenced by capitalism. And then you end up with constituency that's heavily influenced by capitalism. And then it's easy for the elected persons to say, oh, well, yes, this shouldn't have been this way, but voted for it anyway. Jason Probst is a leading member of the Democrats there in the legislature. And he said something almost exactly to that effect, which was that, essentially, I'm going to hold my nose and vote for this. Presumably, I suppose, because he would have been held to account by his constituents if he hadn't sacrificed transparency in the name of economics, right? So we made a choice. This state has made a choice, and when you have the commerce director, who is also the lieutenant governor, you really are going to end up with an economic-centric administration, and it's very clear that the way that all of these folks think, maybe they have their partisan issues over bathroom bills or whatever, but I think they see the same a lot more than they see different.
When it comes to money.
And especially when it comes to money.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no checks and balances. And that's how you end up with the State Finance Commission making decisions in secret to bring Panasonic, and how we're poised now to have the Chiefs and Royals potentially come despite the bare minimum of taxpayer involvement and understanding.
And so what are the implications, in your opinion, for the Kansas Open Records Act and the Kansas Open Meeting Act? Like, are they even relevant anymore? Or is it just this particular situation where we want to attract big businesses where they're not going to follow that? Or, I mean, it opens the door, right?
Absolutely. Well, what it opens the door to is that the legislature can opt out of either one of those laws whenever there's enough consensus to do so. I mean, that's the main thing. And so what that says is that there is that Cora and Coma don't stand as any sort of bulwark or guarantee that there's going to be transparency, because what they've done with Apex and what they're and who knows where the status is with the Chiefs and Royals bill at this point. I mean, stuff gets done so fast in this special session. I don't know where things are at this point, but if they go with what they plan on as far as the Legislative Coordinating Council and do it the same way that they conferred the authority on the State Finance Council under Apex to ignore Coma, I mean, well, then that precedent just got bolstered up big time, didn't it? Now, I think that from a practical standpoint, I think it's going to be hard to really pull the wool over the public's eyes unless there's a lot of bipartisan support for it. On the other hand, there are a whole bunch of instances in the statutes where there have been just little insertions, little amendments to try to keep things confidential, and that kind of stuff crops up every single session. So it's not like this isn't a time-honored practice necessarily. But the main difference here is that it was just so brazen to keep the public out of these hugely important financial decisions when the finances are based entirely on taxpayer dollars. I mean, the optics of that kind of decision making, theoretically should be really bad, and should have consequences for folks who make the decisions that result in those bad optics. But I think when people go to the polls, I think they're thinking about other stuff. I think they're thinking about abortion, and they're thinking about Medicaid expansion, and I think that's what's happened in this country is that, for better or for worse, for worse, there's been a demotion of the imports of transparency and the interest in trying to discuss it. One of those things, and one of the factors there is a decline of the traditional media. When the media decided that they were going to make all their articles free online, that was the beginning of the end. That decision was made. That was an industry-wide decision, maybe 99, 2000 approximately. That was an industry-wide decision that was made. And so what that did was it taught a generation of people that news is worthless because it's free. If we want to go back and try to really unpack why these things have all happened, I mean, I would look at No Child Left Behind, Bush administration era, defunding of public education. And then I would look at, so that's a government decision, but then I'd look at the private decision by New York Times, Washington Post, et al., the publishing companies, to give their stuff away for free. So you end up with no emphasis placed on education by the government, and no import on elevating the nature and the fundamental importance that news and acquiring knowledge and understanding current events, how important that is when it comes to civics, promoting government, and having a representative democracy. So you put those things together, and then you follow that up with a market crash. You're going to have a lot of disillusioned people who are not particularly educated about their government and really don't care. And that's how MAGA happens.
Yeah. And I guess I see this weird ironic parallel or something where it's like there's more surveillance than ever on most people, just walking around between like
Totally.
doorbells and cell phones and TVs and smart TVs, whatever. Meanwhile, the government is less transparent than ever. So it is like this patronistic, like top down, we can surveil you, but you can't surveil us. Transparency has to go both ways or it becomes something very different. Becomes surveillance state or something.
Well, yeah, it becomes fascism is what it becomes. Yeah. And 9/11, of course, was one of the other things I left out in my previous thing, but that's, of course, very important because, that established the National Security Agency and more or less normalized the notion that the government is just going to be permanently watching us. And, and then we can also talk about school shootings. I mean, if you're talking about things that cause people anxiety and make it hard for them to interact with the public, well, they're not as educated as they were before. They think they're going to get shot when they go to school to try to get educated. I mean, these are, and they also just have come to realize that they're always going to be watched by the government. I mean, that's a lot of trauma. That is a lot of trauma that is being visited on generations, that are, the Zoomers and et cetera. I mean, that is a lot of trauma. I think that in a modern society where, the internet and information comes so quickly and you have a 24-hour news cycle and there can be, one important story might get blasted off the pages the next day. You can just pretend that things aren't happening, stick your head in the sand. It becomes very easy to do that. Nobody's ever processing anything. Nobody is getting over anything. Nobody is ever taking an emotional, stance and saying, hey, you know what? I think this was wrong. What could I do about that? I mean, there are people doing that, but generally speaking, the social interactions between members of a capitalist society, the public interest just falls away. There is no public interest. It's all about a private interest. How am I going to make my quarterly profits? How am I going to pay for my food and for my shelter? And it's just, we just have it's so easy to become an inward looking society when capitalism is all that matters. It's easy to insulate yourself with wealth. I mean, if you have wealth, well, then why should you care what's going on around you? I mean, you can isolate yourself and protect yourself from the things that you don't like. Well, but that doesn't promote a society where everyone is trying to get along. Humans are ultimately social creatures. I mean, why is it that there's pilgrimages to cities and all this kind of stuff and gathering in urban areas and moving away from rural? I mean, it's because this is the natural order of things. I mean, this is humans as a social creature. Humans' willingness to disclose things about themselves, like on Facebook and, create the surveillance culture that you're talking about. It's interesting because it doesn't really go both ways, does it? Because while people have been encouraged through capitalism, and through social media, which of course benefits from advertising capitalism, they're solely motivated by capitalism, right? So by playing into social media, then that becomes, then you're part of the capitalist venture. And so you end up with all of those as the interests that guide your society. Well, then it's really not too much of a surprise that transparency doesn't matter, because you can just be like, well, if the government's just trying to make us money, then I guess it's cool.
Which reminds me, I told you before we started recording, but speaking of social media, I tried to post your article in and around DeSoto, Kansas Facebook group and was blocked by the administrators. So I will link that article here in the show notes. And I do think it's particularly important to the people of DeSoto to know how this all came about, because it's affecting our whole town forever, which has largely stayed the same over the past 30 years or so, and now is undergoing a major transition, which again, isn't bad or good, or, I have no opinion about that. It may be the best thing that ever happened, but that doesn't change the fact that the law was not followed when it comes to bringing this business to my hometown and to Kansas in general. And I'm curious to see what happens with the Chiefs and the Royals. And again, maybe the best thing never happened, but the ends don't always justify the means. Mm-hmm. And that's the frustrating thing is, where do we go from here, Max? What can we do? I mean, I know you mentioned paying attention to who our representatives are and voting them in or voting them out. But even then it's like, well, if it's had bipartisan support, who's to say that the next round of people won't do the same shit.
It all starts local, and so the idea would be, I think, the most important thing, especially given that DeSoto is the epicenter for all this. I mean, I think it would be, So from a DeSoto specific standpoint, and I don't know who the reps or senators are who cover DeSoto, but I would look at that link that's in the article that has how everybody voted. And I would look to see which of your reps and senators voted yes. And then you would want to, ideally, they'd get on this podcast and talk about why they voted yes. So I think the very best thing to be doing is grassroots. I think the leadership and everything, that ship has sailed. So the key is to try to convince local legislators that the constituents are watching, the constituents do pay attention, and that they feel hoodwinked. I think that to the extent that there's local media that covers DeSoto, trying to tip off the paper as to, because can the paper be interviewing these folks? And again, that's the best part, is there's newsworthy hooks coming up all the time because there's new development. So it's not like you always have to be like, oh, we're replowing the ground over this 2022. No, I mean how much? I would just bet tons of money that the rank and file people in DeSoto don't realize that what happened was the result of a secret meeting. I'm sure they don't. And so what would happen if they knew that, right? And so it's up to folks that are publishing and producing information that is consumed by locals to drive the interest, so that the legislators who voted for Apex have to freaking hold a forum to explain why they did it, right? And especially because whoever they are, they're up for election, because everybody is in 2024. What's that candidate forum like? Is that coming up right here in DeSoto? And if it is, if it's not, try to get one started and make it so that the questions about Apex are some of the questions that they have to answer. So because what I've found is that the best way to go about this, what they don't want to have happen, is they don't want to have a personal conversation where they have to look a constituent in the eye and explain why they did a dark thing. They don't want to do that, because here in the Midwest, for the most part, if your rep's not a narcissist, the whole thing about emotional connectivity, that works. That's empathy. That's how you relate. That's how it works. And so I would just encourage that, everyone who voted yes for Apex, who's in that legislative delegation to Topeka, get them on this podcast. Be like, did you realize that when you voted for that, the State Finance Council was going to be able to do what they did without any sort of checks and balances? Or do you push back on that? Do you think that there were checks and balances? If so, what are those? That's the very best thing to be doing, is to make it so that these local reps can't be operate. They think that they can operate in secret because they're inassailable, right? Or maybe anyway, that's part of what their thought process is. Well, debunk that.
So who makes the decision? Is it the whoever drafts the bill makes the decision that they can go around COMA and CORA?
Yeah, that's the complicated question, because that has to do with who the bill sponsor is, and under Kansas law, they don't have to disclose that. So yeah, right. So the answer probably is that we don't know and could only guess who. But yes, generally speaking, it'd be the bill drafters, and so then the bill drafters, of course, represent an interest group, whatever that interest group is. Here, I think it's pretty clear that the interest group was bipartisan leadership. And so however that bill, and you can look again, if you click on the links that are in the article, it'll take you to the ks.legislature.gov page that has all this stuff in it, that shows who the sponsors were and what the original bill was and all that. But yeah, Apex is one of those things that came down from leadership, and that would be one of the things to ask your local reps about, so, because what I think probably happened, I think that the vast majority of people in the legislature had no freaking idea what was in Apex when they voted on it. That would be my guess. Yeah. And so I think that would be
big business, bring a big business to Kansas. Sounds like a good idea. Right?
Exactly. And so, I think it would be very instructive, especially here in this election year, to get the local DeSoto area reps to retell that story. So remind us what went down in 2022 exactly, because, that was the biggest thing that ever happened in DeSoto, pretty much objectively, and one of the biggest economic projects that's ever happened in the entire state of Kansas and even the freaking region. you know. And so, so what role did you play in that decision process? And were you informed, and how can your constituents trust that you will be informed to make these decisions going forward? And even if it doesn't have anything to, maybe even if you did the very best that you could to be informed, what does that say about the fact that you weren't?
Right.
So yeah, I definitely think individualized interviews with everyone responsible for Apex, and to get them on the record to talk about why they did it in a forum or on a podcast or whatever. And to do that between now and the election, I think those are the most important short-term steps.
Who is the man or woman behind the curtain?
That's right. That's right. That's exactly.
So is there anything else you feel like is important that we didn't touch on?
Well, I mean, do you have another couple days? But so no, in the context of this, no. I mean, it's the Chiefs and the Royals thing is coming. Yeah. And legislature has they have a penchant for doing this, where they will get enough of consensus in the legislature to opt out of Cora and Coma. That's to the detriment of the public. And, to the extent that anyone has a legislature, especially in DeSoto, where these things are actually impacting everyone daily, those legislators need to explain the extent to which they were aware and the extent to which they signed off on Apex, specifically how it circumvents open meetings laws.
And whereas with Apex, we were in competition with Oklahoma, I assume with the Chiefs and the Royals, we're in competition with Missouri.
Exactly. Good point. So that I've got sidetracked when I was making that point about competition, but that's exactly right. They're going to say that we need this new bill to lure the Chiefs and the Royals, because if we make the same mistake Oklahoma did when they were competing against us, then Missouri will know exactly what they need to do to undercut our offer. That's what they're going to say. And as a society, we have to decide. Is it more important to do that because of some sort of, ambiguous and arguably nefarious economic goal, or should it be to, try to accomplish that within the rules that were created both by statute and underpinned by the First Amendment? I think that
transparency.
That's right. And sadly, I think this government has made a choice. And it isn't the one that promotes transparency.
I don't like it, but I love Kansas. I love my home state of Kansas. I know you do too. So it's up to us, I guess.
I guess so.
Well, thank you so much, Max, for all of your time, all of your research, all of your intelligence here, just sharing with us. I really appreciate it.
No problem. I really appreciate you having me on, and happy to share about these kind of issues. And the more people who know, the better.
And maybe we'll do a follow-up episode after the Chiefs and the Royals.
Sure. If that bill comes through and we know about that. But there's no question that the Apex stuff is directly related to your local audience. And, and they really should be asking questions.
Right. Especially because I can't post on the local Facebook group.
Yeah, apparently not. Apparently not. Unreal.
Thank you, Max.
All right, Lindsay, no problem.